The galaxy had seen many wonders, civilizations that built cities inside dying stars, species that communicated through colors no human eye could see, empires that stretched across 1,000 worlds, but nothing had confused the alien races more than one simple human concept: forgiveness. Stood before the Galactic Council, his four eyes blinking in disbelief. He was a member of a species known for their perfect memory. They never forgot anything, not a kindness, not a wrong. His people carried grudges for 10,000 years, passing them down through generations like precious heirlooms. The war between his people and the Had lasted 800 generations. No one remembered why it started anymore, but everyone remembered every death, every battle, every insult. Now a human stood before him, a small creature with soft skin and weak bones. Doctor was her name. She was something called a redemption scholar. The title made no sense to. How could one study redemption? Redemption was a myth, a fairy tale. Once something was broken, it stayed broken forever. Smiled at the assembled aliens. 17 different species filled the great hall. Some floated in liquid tanks. Others perched on specialized platforms. A few existed only as projected consciousness from distant worlds. They had all come to hear about humanity's strangest gift. She began her presentation with a story from old Earth, a story about two nations that had nearly destroyed each other in a great war. Millions had died, cities had burned, hatred had seemed eternal, but then something impossible happened. The survivors chose to forgive, not to forget, never to forget, but to forgive. They built new cities together. Their children played together. They married each other. The council members shifted uncomfortably. This made no logical sense. The delegate, a being of pure crystal, sent a sharp frequency of confusion. How could victims forgive their attackers? How could attackers forgive themselves? The math did not compute. Explained that humans had learned this practice through thousands of years of terrible mistakes. Every human civilization had discovered forgiveness separately. Every human religion had taught it differently, but they had all arrived at the same truth. Carrying hatred was like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die. Forgiveness was not a gift to the wrongdoer. It was a gift to yourself. In the back of the hall, Ambassador of the Collective listened carefully. His species was dying, not from disease or war, but from something far worse: shame. 300 years ago, they had made a terrible mistake. They had accidentally destroyed a moon while testing new weapons. The moon had been home to a primitive species. Billions of innocent creatures had died. Since that day, they had punished themselves without end. They had dismantled their military. They had isolated themselves from the galaxy. They had stopped having children. They believed they did not deserve to continue existing. Noticed him watching. She had studied his people. She had come here specifically for them. After the council session ended, she approached him, flinched away. He did not deserve kindness. No deserved anything good ever again. This was what his people believed with absolute certainty. Sat down beside him anyway. She told him another story. This one was about a human nation that had committed terrible crimes against its own people. Millions had been murdered in factories of death. The horror had been so great that many thought the nation should be erased from history. Some wanted revenge without end. Some wanted eternal punishment. But others chose a different path. They demanded truth first. They demanded acknowledgement. They demanded that every victim be remembered. And then, slowly, painfully, they began the work of forgiveness. Not because the crimes were acceptable, never that, but because the alternative was an endless cycle of pain that would poison the future. His color changed. This was how his species showed tears. He asked how this was possible. How could anyone move forward after such darkness? His people had been trying to make amends for 3 centuries. Nothing helped. The guilt only grew heavier with each passing year. Explained that humans had developed something called restorative justice. It was not about punishment. It was not about forgetting. It was about healing. The wrongdoer had to face their victims. They had to hear the pain they had caused. They had to take responsibility without excuses. And then, together, everyone had to build something new from the broken pieces. She told him about the human scholars who had dedicated their lives to this work. They traveled to war zones and disaster areas. They brought enemies together in small rooms. They helped people find words for unspeakable pain. They witnessed confessions and accusations. They held space for rage and grief. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, they watched miracles happen. They watched hatred transform into understanding. They watched enemies become allies. They watched the impossible become real. The redemption scholars had been doing this work on Earth for generations. Now they were ready to share it with the galaxy. Asked why humans would help other species, what did they gain from this? Surely there was some trick, some hidden advantage. Laughed softly. She told him that humans had learned something important through their long history of conflict. Peace was not the absence of war. Peace was a living thing that needed constant care, and peace anywhere made peace everywhere more possible. When they healed, the whole galaxy would benefit. When ancient enemies reconciled, new possibilities opened for everyone. Over the next year, worked closely with She brought other redemption scholars to their world. They listened to stories that had never been told. They helped to create memorials for their victims. They guided them through ceremonies of acknowledgement. They taught them that guilt was useful only if it led to positive action. Guilt that only caused suffering was guilt misused. Slowly, they began to change. They started allowing visitors again. They began talking to their neighbors. For the first time in 3 centuries, young couples started having children, not because they had forgotten their crime, not because they had been forgiven by the dead, but because they had learned that punishing themselves forever helped no one. The best way to honor the lost was to create new life and make sure the mistake was never repeated. Word spread through the galaxy. Other species began seeking out the human scholars. The requested help ending their ancient war with The process took decades. There were setbacks and failures. Some individuals refused to participate. Some wounds were too deep to heal in one generation. But the scholars kept working. They passed their knowledge to new students. They trained aliens in the arts they had developed on Earth. 100 years passed. Then 200. The human redemption scholars became something like a galactic institution. They were welcomed on 1,000 worlds. They mediated disputes between empires. They helped refugees and conquerors find common ground. They showed the galaxy that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their creativity or their stubbornness. Humanity's greatest strength was their willingness to believe that anyone could change. Now an old looked back on his long life. He remembered the day he had first heard speak. He remembered his confusion and disbelief. He remembered thinking that forgiveness was a weakness, a sign of poor memory, a failure of justice. He had been so wrong. His people and they were now close allies. They shared worlds and resources. Their children learned each other's languages. The 800-generation war was finally over, not because one side had won, not because everyone had died, but because they had chosen together to stop. Had become a redemption scholar himself. He was the first to earn that title. He worked alongside humans and in dozens of other species. They had formed a network that spanned the galaxy. They were always busy. There was always pain somewhere that needed tending. There were always old hatreds that needed transforming. But they were making progress. The galaxy was becoming a little bit kinder with each passing century. In her final years, wrote a book that became required reading on 10,000 worlds. She explained that forgiveness was not a single act. It was a practice. It required daily effort. It required patience and courage and humility. It meant accepting that you would sometimes fail. It meant getting up and trying again anyway. She wrote that every sentient species carried trauma. War and loss and betrayal were universal experiences, but healing was also possible for everyone. The path was difficult. The work was hard, but the destination was worth every painful step. Her last chapter was about hope. She wrote that humans had once been a young species, primitive and violent, trapped on a single small planet. They had nearly destroyed themselves many times. They had created weapons that could end all life. They had built systems that crushed the weak and rewarded cruelty. But they had also produced artists and healers and teachers. They had discovered compassion and cooperation and love. They had learned, slowly and painfully, that forgiveness was stronger than revenge. That connection was better than isolation. That building was more satisfying than destroying. Now humans were scattered across the stars. They were not the strongest species or the oldest or the most advanced, but they carried something precious with them wherever they went. They carried the knowledge that the past did not have to determine the future. They carried the belief that every being deserved a chance at redemption. This was humanity's gift to the galaxy, not technology or territory or treasure, but a simple practice that had taken thousands of years to learn. The practice of letting go. The galaxy looked at humans differently after that. They were still strange little creatures, soft and fragile and short-lived, but they understood something that older, wiser species had missed. They understood that the greatest strength was not the ability to destroy your enemies. The greatest strength was the ability to make them your friends. And somewhere in the quiet corners of 1,000 worlds, the redemption scholars continued their work. They listened to stories of pain. They witnessed ceremonies of reconciliation. They helped ancient enemies shake hands and share meals. They proved again and again that miracles were possible. All it took was the courage to forgive. All it took was the wisdom to try.